So this is from when I was pretty young, perhaps about 12 or so. Now when there is no electricity for lengthy periods of time, we either sit outside our homes or on rooftops, correct? The same thing happened on a summer night. We were all sitting outside. Note that there is a large, long balcony that leads to the main door of our house, and we were living in an apartment on the 3rd floor. Around 11 p.m., we decided to sleep right there in our balcony. But my mother and brother were not sleepy and were still inside doing something. I'm not sure how long they were inside. But my father and I dozed off right there. A few moments later, I heard a loud scream, or more like someone shouting for help. I saw my father sleeping and wanted to wake him up, but for some reason I didn't. I'm not sure why. Then, around midnight, I woke up to the same loud scream. It sounded like a male just saying. And this went on for the entire night. He kept shouting, and it felt like he was going far rather than coming close, as if he was running or walking. I'm not sure. Now, I'm not sure if my mother and brother slept inside or outside with us, but I couldn't sleep all night because I kept hearing this person. I recall that this was not a dream, and there was no report of any event the next day, but I did not tell anyone. Although, now that I'm 18, I recently informed my brother about the incident, and he has no recollection of what happened that night. According to him, if there was no news, it was most likely a dream, or I was simply half asleep. But every time I think about that night, I get chills and wish I knew if it was true. You know how sometimes you have recollections but can't remember if they're from a dream or reality? So, although the event was short, it was terrifying for both me and my mother. So that was about May-June 2019. My father was away for business reasons, so there was just my mother, me, and my 6-year-old sister at home. It was around the evening when I was in the kitchen with my mother, speaking with her while she prepared supper. Let me show you our kitchen. It looked like this, with the kitchen on the left and the bathroom on the other. So if you stand in the kitchen, you can watch whether someone uses the restroom. My mother was facing the wall and I was standing leaning on the kitchen stand, but I was staring at my mother. My little sister ran to the restroom and closed the door, but we disregarded it, assuming she was in a rush. Now, 25 minutes later, I asked Mom what was keeping her so long. Why isn't she coming? My mother told me to have a look. I checked the restroom, but to my amazement, there was no one. Even the lights were out. I told my mother and she replied it couldn't be possible. Go ask your sister. When I got into her room, she was fast sleeping. I was surprised and terrified to the core. I informed my mother, and she was equally concerned about who arrived. When my sister awoke, we inquired whether she needed to use the restroom. She questioned why she would use the general bathroom when she had her own in her room. It still haunts us. This event occurred in 2011. I was working a night shift at the time. I had to walk around 10 minutes to get to the cab since our street had a traffic block to prevent four-wheelers from coming through. There was a graveyard opposite our house, and being on the 1st floor, I had a good view of what was going on there. One night, as I was leaving for work, I noticed an undertaker walking from the graveyard. I assumed he was going someplace else, but he approached me and said, "Did you see her?" I was perplexed and asked him who he was referring to. He grew agitated and said, "Did you see her or not?" Assuming he was inebriated, I chose to leave without saying anything. The next day, a new individual arrived at the cemetery and came to our house to collect some water. Curious about the prior guy, I asked about his location. To my surprise, he told me that the man died in a vehicle accident 2 days before and was cremated the day before. I was astonished for a while, wondering how I had seen him the night before he died 2 days before. The event shocked me, and after a few months, we decided to leave the area. The recollection of that strange experience still haunts me to this day. Aniket had to relocate to a new city due to his new work. He was looking for an affordable and spacious property to rent. After a thorough search, he entered a 3-story flat. He went to the owner's residence on the ground level. He knocked on the door, and the owner answered it after seeing him via the peephole. He opted to rent a property on the 1st floor after hearing about the fair and low cost of a huge unit. The owner's smile as he went made him interested. He moved into the house and started working at the new workplace. He became increasingly busy with his everyday routine. Someone from the neighborhood warned him that the owner is insane and that he should have rented another house, but he rejected the proposal because it was an ideal house for him. Now the owner's smile creeps him out and makes him anxious whenever they meet. The next week was his week off from work, so he chose to recuperate at home. He heard a knock on his door late in the morning. He answered the door and saw his new roommate with suitcases. He permitted him to enter. After that, they had a lengthy conversation. They were both chatting about why other flats are unoccupied, and they agreed to discuss it with the owner after supper. They had supper, and as soon as they finished, the lights went out. However, they can see light coming from the bottom of the door, since the corridor lights are turned on. Suddenly, they heard heavy pounding on the door. Aniket was able to approach the door because light was streaming from below it. Aniket peeked through the peephole and saw the owner holding an axe. Aniket became terrified when he recalled the conversation with his neighbor. He went back and began searching for a cabinet in which to hide. He somehow discovered the cupboard door in the darkness. Aniket entered the cabinet and felt like someone was already there. It was his roommate. His roommate advised him to get out of the cabinet and hide someplace else. Aniket questioned, "Why? This is the place where the owner killed me the last time," responded the roommate. "I don't believe in the supernatural, yet what occurred to me was an unsettling coincidence. It occurred some years ago, and I was around 7 years old. My family and I were to a cemetery because we wanted to visit my grandfather, whom we seldom see because we live so far away. It was really my first visit. He had died when I was 3, so by the time we came, the graveyard had changed a lot. Sadly, more people had died, and the graveyard had become bigger. It was pouring, so I brought my umbrella with me. It was a tiny one for a child, and I was carrying it around to shield myself from the rain. I also recall really enjoying it. We spent an hour hunting for my grandfather's grave, but couldn't find it. We looked around every corner, but it didn't seem to be there, so my father told us to go home because we had a long journey ahead of us and needed to return home. So I was walking through the rows of graves to find my family when my umbrella became trapped in a shrub near one of the graves. I kept pressing and tried to get it out, but it refused to let go. Because I didn't want to leave the umbrella there, my father approached me and offered to assist. It took a long, and I'm not sure how it got stuck so hard, but it simply wouldn't come out of the plant. When my father eventually untangled the umbrella from the bush, he glanced up only to discover that the bush was on my grandfather's grave. I was once transported to the hospital during school hours due to severe cramping. They administered some fluids and requested me to stay overnight in the observation rooms. That night, I got up at 9:30 p.m. to consume food. My parents were out of town, so there wasn't anyone in particular there to accompany me. Around 12 a.m., I was still awake watching TV. When it turned off, I tried to turn it back on, but it didn't work, so I went for a walk. This is where it happened. After my stroll, I was returning to my room when I noticed another patient sitting close to the chemotherapy room. I didn't want to bother them, so I just left. The next day, a nurse I became close to informed me that a girl my age had died of cancer the night before. I then remembered the person I saw and notified the nurse, but she denied it, saying that the patient was unable to move themselves and died about 10:50 p.m. This definitely made my chest heavy, and I couldn't breathe well. It could have been anyone sitting, but I believe I saw a ghost. I really attended the funeral. Her name was Lily, and I saw some of her images and swear she was sitting just how I remembered that girl. I worked in intensive care for 12 years and seen some unusual occurrences. One night, 4 patients in a row lost critically vital lines. There was no one else in the room. Our desks were built with a desk between 2 patient rooms. We could view both rooms from the same desk. The patients were drugged and on the ventilator. The first included a center line that pulled out. We completed that, stabilized the patient, and then the next patient removed their breathing tube. Next comes a feeding tube. Next, another breathing tube. We couldn't find out why this happened. Some patients would see a tiny boy in red pajamas approach their door or enter their chambers. The patient would die shortly thereafter. I only had one patient see him. She suffered a stroke. We were merely providing comfort care. I was working the night shift. Throughout the night, she would become terrified, so I would hold her hand and we would converse as best we could, which would settle her down. During one such conversation, she added, "Watch out for Bruce." Bruce is my father's name. This woman didn't know me or my father, and I hadn't mentioned him while caring for her. I asked, "Who is Bruce?" Perhaps it was someone close to her. She chuckled, saying, "You know who he is. You look just like him." I had goosebumps all over. I do look like my father. Exactly like him, she warned. Watch out for him. Make sure he does not fall. And then she fell asleep. A bit later, she noticed the small child dressed in red. She wanted to know who he was and why we had children in the unit. I informed her that we didn't. This was an adult intensive care unit. I asked her to describe him. She responded, I believe he's approximately 2 years old, blonde, wearing red pajamas. He comes to the door and simply stares at me. He does not come inside. She died later that day while on the day shift. We had superstitions about several things. For example, if a patient was dying, tie a knot in the bedsheet to keep the patient alive throughout your shift. If a patient appears to be dying for an exceptionally lengthy time, open the doors or windows to allow their souls to leave. Sometimes patients would wait until a specific loved one came at the hospital to say their farewell. Some patients would wait until a specific date had passed so that they would not die on an anniversary, birthday, or other significant occasion. We occasionally had a room where numerous people died in a succession. So, after 3 deaths, we started requesting the priest to clean the room. This would nearly usually terminate the cycle. The worst thing I observed was an elderly woman who was quite unpleasant. She stayed in our flat for a few days. She was terrible. She would say unpleasant things to the employees. She cursed out everyone. She had no family or friends that came to see her. She experienced a cardiac arrest one night, so we put her on a ventilator. She was awake on the ventilator, and she was afraid. She was staring up, not seeing anything in this world, and shaking her head. No, forcefully. She held her arms up as if to defend herself. She appeared to be attempting to scream, but the breathing tube prevented her from making any sound. We attempted to calm her down and sedate her, but nothing helped. She died after suffering another heart attack. Following her death, we called her sons. It was then that we realized why no one came. She had harmed her 2 boys throughout their lives. Both had broken off communication with her. Whether you believe in hell or not, she was headed somewhere she didn't want to be.